There's a quiet fear that appears after a certain kind of inner growth. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive as panic. It appears as a question you hesitate to say out loud. If I'm not competing anymore, am I fall behind? This fear does not come from laziness. It does not come from failure. It comes from disorientation. For most of life, competition organizes meaning. You know where you stand because someone else stands opposite you. You know what to strive for because someone else wants the same thing. You know you are moving forward because others are behind you. Competition provides orientation. So when competition collapses, the psyche loses a familiar structure. And this collapse often happens after genuine inner growth, not before. This is why it feels confusing. You are not exhausted. You are not incapable. You are often more competent than before. Yet the drive to win fades. The need to compare weakens. The impulse to prove something dissolves. And instead of relief, many people feel concern. They assume something essential has been lost. They assume motivation is declining. They assume this is the beginning of stagnation. But what is actually happening is more precise than that. The psyche is reorganizing around a different center. Competition belongs to identity, not to capacity. This distinction is rarely explained. Competition is not required for excellence. It is required for identity reinforcement. Early in life, comparison is necessary. It helps the ego locate itself. You learn who you are by noticing who you are not. You learn your strengths by seeing others outperform you. You learn your limits by losing. Jung acknowledged this openly. He understood that comparison is a natural and necessary phase of psychological development. But what is necessary early becomes destructive later. Once identity matures, comparison no longer serves growth. It serves maintenance. It keeps the ego intact by constantly measuring it against others. And when the ego loosens through inner work, competition loses its organizing role. This does not feel like victory. It feels like emptiness at first, because the structure that once told you why to act is gone. Most people never experience this phase consciously. They rebuild ego immediately. They replace one form of competition with another. If it is no longer about money, it becomes about morality. If it is no longer about status, it becomes about insight. If it is no longer about success, it becomes about being more evolved. The ego is adaptive. It will find a new rival. But when individuation is genuine, something different happens. The impulse to compare does not migrate. It dissolves. And when that happens, the psyche asks a frightening question. If I am not measuring myself against anyone, what moves me now? This is the hidden fear beneath the surface. If I stop competing, I will disappear. Not socially, psychologically, because for most people, identity exists in contrast. Without contrast, the ego fears dissolution, so the loss of competitiveness is often interpreted as danger. But Jung did not see it that way. He saw competition as a scaffold, necessary until the structure can stand on its own. Once the inner center stabilizes, comparison becomes noise, not because the person becomes passive, but because motivation no longer comes from opposition. This is where misunderstanding begins. Modern culture treats competition as synonymous with vitality. If you are not competing, you must be declining. If you are not driven to win, you must be complacent. If you are not proving yourself, you must be afraid. But this logic assumes that all effort is reactive. It assumes action only exists in response to others. Jung challenged this assumption. He believed that once the ego is no longer the center, motivation reorganizes around necessity rather than rivalry. This is difficult to recognize because necessity is quiet. It does not create urgency unless something truly requires attention. Competition creates constant urgency. There's always someone to beat, always something to defend. When that structure collapses, time feels different. There is more space. And space can feel like emptiness if you are accustomed to pressure. This is why people often mistake the loss of competitiveness for depression or decline. But the emotional tone is different. There's no despair. There is no hopelessness. There is simply a lack of agitation. The nervous system is no longer mobilized by comparison. And without that mobilization, The psyche feels still. Stillness can be deeply uncomfortable if you have never known motivation without tension. Most ambition is anxiety-driven. This is rarely acknowledged. People believe they are chasing excellence, but they are often fleeing insignificance. Competition provides relief from that fear. As long as you are striving, you exist. When striving stops, the ego asks, "Do I still matter?" After inner growth, that question loses urgency, not because it is answered intellectually, but because identity is no longer dependent on constant reinforcement. Jung believed that comparison is rooted in persona. The persona needs external markers: rank, recognition, relative position. When identity loosens its attachment to persona, these markers lose their charge. They still exist. They simply no longer define. This is why you may still perform well without caring about outperforming. You may still work diligently without wanting to win. You may still improve without measuring yourself against others. From the outside, this looks contradictory. From the inside, it feels natural. But because culture equates competition with competence, people fear this shift. They assume effort requires rivalry. They assume excellence needs an enemy. This assumption is false. It is historically recent and psychologically immature. Excellence does not require comparison. Comparison is one way to initiate effort. It is not the only way to sustain it. After individuation, effort becomes situational. You respond to what the situation requires, not to how others are performing. This produces a different quality of action, less frantic, more exact. Effort becomes precise instead of reactive. Reactive effort is always excessive. It overworks. It pushes beyond necessity. It creates burnout because it is not responding to reality. It is responding to threat. Threat of being outdone. Threat of being surpassed. Threat of being irrelevant. When competition collapses, these threats lose their grip. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you care about different things. Accuracy, appropriateness, timing. You act because something needs to be done, not because someone else is doing it better. This distinction is subtle but profound. Most people never experience motivation without rivalry. So when rivalry disappears, they panic. They think motivation is gone. But what is gone is reactive motivation. Intrinsic motivation does not announce itself loudly. It does not feel urgent. It feels obvious. You do what is required because it is required. No comparison needed. Jung believed this shift marked a psychological threshold. Before this point, the ego organizes life around differentiation. After this point, the psyche organizes life around integration. Integration does not need rivals. It needs coherence. This is why competition feels irrelevant after growth. Not because you have transcended others, but because others are no longer organizing your inner life. Your orientation comes from within the situation itself. This can feel disorienting at first, because competition provides clarity. It tells you what matters by telling you who matters. When that structure disappears, meaning must be sensed rather than imposed. This takes time. And during that time, people often feel unmoored. They wonder if they are becoming apathetic. They wonder if they are losing ambition. They wonder if they are falling behind. But falling behind implies a race. And the race has ended, not because you quit, but because the finish line no longer organizes your movement. You are no longer running against something. You are moving with something. Reality. This is why Jung framed certain life problems as outgrown, not solved. Competition is not defeated. It is outgrown. It no longer fits the structure of the psyche. Trying to reintroduce it feels artificial, forced. Like wearing a uniform from a previous life. You can put it on, but it does not move naturally. Many people attempt to revive competition because they fear what replaces it. They fear emptiness. But what replaces competition is not emptiness. It is orientation without opposition. Instead of asking, "How do I compare?" the psyche begins asking, "What does this situation require?" This question does not inflate the ego. It does not produce excitement. It produces clarity, and clarity feels calm. This calm is often mistaken for weakness, but weakness collapses under demand. This calm does not. It responds, just not theatrically. Another source of confusion is that competition once provided identity feedback. You knew who you were because you knew where you stood. Without comparison, identity becomes less defined. This is unsettling. People often describe feeling less driven or less hungry. But hunger was never the point. Hunger was a signal of lack. When identity stabilizes, hunger diminishes. This does not reduce capability. It reduces compulsion. You are no longer compelled to demonstrate worth. This frees enormous psychological energy. But if you do not recognize it, that energy feels unused, like potential without direction. Direction now comes from meaning rather than rivalry. And meaning does not shout. It reveals itself gradually. Jung emphasized that individuation changes the source of motivation. Before, motivation is external. After, it is contextual. You respond to what is in front of you, not to how you rank. This creates a sense of sufficiency. You do enough, not more than others. Enough for the moment. This is deeply countercultural. And because it is countercultural, it is easily misinterpreted. People around you may notice the change. They may say you seem less ambitious, less competitive, less driven. They may project decline onto you. This projection can destabilize you if you are not grounded. You may start doubting your own inner state. You may try to reintroduce competition artificially to reassure yourself. But artificial competition quickly feels hollow because the psyche knows it is unnecessary. This is where ego-regression often occurs. People rebuild status games to avoid the uncertainty of intrinsic motivation. They chase recognition. They compare again. And they feel briefly energized. But something feels wrong because the energy is reactive again, anxious, tight, short-lived. Jung warned that regression often disguises itself as productivity. You appear active, but you are psychologically moving backward. True growth often looks quieter than regression because it is not fueled by anxiety. The collapse of competition is one of the clearest signs that identity is no longer organized around opposition. This does not make you superior. It makes you less dependent. And dependency was always a hidden cost of competition. You needed others to exist in a certain way for you to feel motivated. Now you do not. This independence feels risky because it removes familiar pressure. But it also removes distortion. Effort without rivalry is cleaner. You do not overdo. You do not underdo. You respond. This is a foundation for the next phase. In the next act, we will examine why excellence does not disappear when competition ends, why performance can actually improve, and how functioning without comparison creates a different, more stable relationship to effort and outcome. For now, understand this. If you no longer feel driven to compete, it does not mean you are declining. It means identity is no longer being held together by comparison. And that is not weakness. It is a structural shift, one that most people never reach. Because competition is easier than coherence, and rivalry is louder than clarity. But clarity lasts, and it does not need to win. When competition collapses, the first thing people fear is loss of sharpness. They assume that without rivalry, standards will drop, that effort will soften, that discipline will decay. This assumption is understandable. For most of life, competition has functioned as an external regulator. It provided pressure, deadlines, benchmarks. It forced performance even when inner clarity was absent. So when competition fades, the psyche expects collapse. But what often collapses instead is excess, the over-effort, the unnecessary striving, the constant self-surveillance. What remains is not dullness. It is accuracy. Competition pushes you to do more than necessary, not because the task requires it, but because the comparison demands it. You work harder to stay ahead. You refine endlessly to outperform. You exhaust yourself to secure a position. This creates the illusion of excellence. But much of that energy is spent managing anxiety, not improving function. When comparison no longer organizes motivation, effort recalibrates. You stop doing what is impressive. You start doing what is required. This feels like decline only if you equate intensity with quality. But intensity is not precision. Often it obscures it. Jung observed that once identity is no longer threatened by relative position, action becomes more exact, not slower, exact. You no longer overproduce. You no longer overexplain. You no longer overreach. You respond proportionally. This is unsettling to others, because proportionality looks like underperformance in a culture addicted to escalation. People are accustomed to excess. They equate seriousness with strain. So when strain disappears, they assume seriousness has vanished. But seriousness without anxiety looks quiet. This is where misunderstanding deepens. Without competition, people assume excellence must fade. But excellence was never produced by rivalry. Rivalry produces volume. Excellence produces fit. Fit means the action matches the situation. Not more, not less. Competition does not care about fit. It cares about dominance. So it pushes beyond what is necessary. This is why competitive systems burn people out. They reward escalation, not accuracy. When competition collapses internally, the nervous system settles. This changes how attention operates. You are no longer scanning for threats. You are no longer monitoring others constantly. This frees perceptual bandwidth. You notice details you previously missed. Subtleties, timing, context. Your work may appear less dramatic, but it often becomes more effective because it is no longer driven by urgency. Urgency distorts judgment. Calm sharpens it. This is difficult to accept because calm has been culturally reframed as complacency. But complacency avoids effort. Calm chooses it carefully. The absence of competition does not remove standards. It removes externalized standards. Standards become internal, situational, responsive. This is a significant psychological shift. Instead of asking, how good is this compared to others? You ask, is this adequate for what is actually needed? Adequacy is not mediocrity. It is appropriateness. And appropriateness is rarely celebrated because it does not outperform. It fits. Competition thrives on excess visibility. Appropriateness thrives on function. One draws attention. The other creates stability. This is why systems led by non-competitive individuals often feel boring. But boring systems tend to last. They are not fueled by constant comparison. They are maintained by clarity. Jung believed that once the ego loosens, performance becomes less performative. This is crucial. Performance driven by comparison always includes an audience, real or imagined. You are not just acting. You are being seen. When that audience dissolves, action becomes private. Even when it is public, you are no longer staging yourself. You are executing. This removes psychological friction, but also removes emotional reward. There is less excitement, less affirmation. This is where people misinterpret the experience. They assume the absence of emotional reward means the absence of value. But emotional reward was never a reliable indicator of value. It was an indicator of ego reinforcement. Without competition, success feels muted. Failure feels muted too. Both lose dramatic charge. This emotional flattening is often misdiagnosed. People think something is wrong. But what has flattened is the evaluation system, not the capacity. The psyche is no longer spiking itself with comparison-based meaning. Meaning becomes quieter, more distributed, less attached to outcomes. This creates resilience, because when outcomes change, identity does not collapse. In competitive orientation, loss threatens the self. In non-competitive orientation, loss is information. You adjust, not emotionally, functionally. This is one of the most important shifts. Without rivalry, feedback becomes usable. When identity is not at stake, criticism does not wound as deeply. Praise does not inflate as dangerously. You can see more clearly. This is why excellence can improve after competition ends, because distortion decreases. The mind is no longer defending an image. It is solving a problem. This also changes learning. In competitive mode, learning is strategic. You learn what gives advantage. You hide weaknesses. You optimize perception. In non-competitive mode, Learning is honest. You see what is missing. You correct without shame. You refine without urgency. This creates long-term competence, not flashy growth, but stable mastery. People often confuse mastery with dominance. They assume the best must always be visibly superior. But mastery is often invisible. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself only when needed. Competition keeps skills in constant display mode. Mastery keeps them in reserve. This is another reason the loss of competitiveness feels risky. You're no longer advertising capability. You trust it to be there when required. This trust feels vulnerable because it removes constant reassurance. But it is also more accurate. You no longer need to prove readiness. You simply respond when the situation demands. This orientation changes how you relate to others. Without competition, others are no longer obstacles or benchmarks. They become part of the environment, sometimes collaborators, sometimes irrelevant, sometimes teachers, but rarely threats. This reduces interpersonal tension dramatically. You are less reactive to other success, less defensive about your own position. This emotional neutrality can be misread as detachment or lack of ambition, but ambition has simply shifted form. It is no longer about surpassing. It is about adequacy and contribution. Contribution is not glamorous. It does not produce winners. It produces continuity. This is why competition dominates early life. Early life requires differentiation. You must separate, define yourself, claim territory. Later life requires integration. You must fit, stabilize, support. Competition is excellent at separation. It is poor at integration. So when identity matures, competition becomes maladaptive. It introduces friction where none is needed. It disturbs coherence. This does not mean challenges disappear. It means challenges are no longer personalized. You are not battling others. You are responding to reality. This reduces emotional waste. Most exhaustion does not come from work. It comes from comparison layered on top of work. Remove comparison and energy returns. But it returns quietly, not as adrenaline, as steadiness. This steadiness is often underestimated, but it is what allows sustained effort without burnout. Competitive energy is powerful but unstable. Intrinsic energy is moderate but reliable. Jung warned that the ego mistakes intensity for vitality, but vitality is measured by endurance, not spikes. When competition collapses, endurance increases, because the psyche is no longer oscillating between inflation and deflation. There is less emotional swing. This emotional consistency supports better judgment. Better judgment supports better outcomes. But outcomes are no longer used to measure self-worth. They are evaluated pragmatically. Did this work? Did it not? No drama. This is profoundly disorienting for people accustomed to emotional stakes. Life feels flatter at first, but flatter is not emptier. It is less distorted. This flattening creates space for a different kind of satisfaction, one that is not comparative, one that is situational. You feel satisfied when something fits, when a response is appropriate, when effort meets requirement exactly. This satisfaction is subtle. It does not spike dopamine. It settles, and because it settles, it is often overlooked, but it accumulates. Quietly, this is a psychological foundation for the final act. Because once competition no longer organizes effort, a new orientation must take its place. Not apathy, not passivity, but coherence. In the next act, we will examine what replaces competition entirely, how action continues without rivalry, how meaning persists without comparison, and why this orientation is not only stable, but necessary for mature psychological functioning. For now, understand this. The end of competition does not mark the end of excellence. It marks the end of distortion. What remains is effort aligned with reality. And that alignment does not need to win. It needs to work. When competition no longer organizes motivation, something fundamental changes, not externally, internally. The question driving action is no longer, where do I stand? Or, how do I measure up? Those questions simply stop appearing. And when they disappear, a deeper orientation quietly takes their place. What does the situation actually require? This question does not elevate the self. It does not diminish it either. It removes the self from the center altogether. This is a final shift, not away from effort, not away from excellence, but away from self-referential motivation. Jung understood this transition as a movement away from identity maintenance. Once identity no longer needs constant reinforcement, behavior reorganizes around function. You do not act to confirm who you are. You act because something needs to be done. This is the difference most people miss. They assume competition is replaced by apathy. But what replaces competition is coherence. Coherence does not rush. It does not prove. It does not escalate. It responds. When competition was active, motivation was comparative. You acted in relation to others. When competition collapses, motivation becomes contextual. You act in relation to reality. This is not a poetic distinction. It is structural. Comparative motivation depends on external reference points. Contextual motivation depends on perception. You must actually see what is happening, not just how you appear within it. This requires maturity, because perception without comparison offers no immediate reward. There is no victory, no ranking, no confirmation, only accuracy. Accuracy is emotionally quiet. It does not stimulate the ego, but it stabilizes action. This is why people often feel strangely anonymous to themselves after this shift. They are still capable, still functioning, still engaged, but they are no longer narrating themselves internally. The inner commentary fades. And without commentary, experience feels less dramatic, but also less distorted. This is where fear often returns one last time. If I'm not defining myself through comparison, what defines me? The answer is uncomfortable. Nothing, not in the way the ego expects. Identity becomes looser, more flexible, less defended. You are no longer someone in contrast. You are someone in relation to reality, not to rivals. This creates psychological resilience, because reality changes. But rivals always threaten. When identity is built on opposition, peace is impossible. There is always someone ahead, someone behind, someone threatening position. But when identity is no longer built that way, tension drops. Not because life becomes easier, but because the psyche stops manufacturing unnecessary threats. This is a quiet relief many people feel after competition ends. They are not excited. They are relieved. Relief is not weakness. It is the absence of distortion. Jung believed that much of human striving is compensation. People compete not because they love excellence, but because they fear insignificance. Once that fear loosens, competition loses fuel. And when fuel disappears, the engine stops. But movement does not. It simply changes its source. Now, movement comes from necessity, from appropriateness, from responsibility. Responsibility is often misunderstood. It is not burden. It is alignment with what is required. When you act from responsibility, there is no internal resistance. You do not need to push yourself. You respond. This is why effort after competition feels different. You are not forcing energy. You are allowing direction. This direction is not chosen to enhance identity. It is chosen because it fits the moment. Fit replaces victory. And fit does not compare itself. It simply works. This also changes how you relate to success. Success without competition does not inflate. It does not produce stories. It does not expand identity. It feels correct, like something that landed where it should have. And once it lands, it does not linger psychologically. You move on. This can be unsettling, because society teaches that success should feel euphoric. But euphoria was never about success. It was about validation. When validation is no longer needed, success becomes quieter, more neutral, but also less addictive. Failure changes too. Without competition, failure does not threaten identity. It becomes feedback. Something did not fit. Something needs adjustment. No humiliation. No collapse. This emotional neutrality is often mistaken for detachment, But detachment avoids involvement. This state does not. It engages fully. It simply does not dramatize engagement. This is one of the most important distinctions. You are not less involved in life. You are less entangled with yourself. This frees attention. And freed attention improves judgment. You see more, react less, decide with greater accuracy. This is why Jung believed individuation increased ethical responsibility, not moral superiority. Responsibility. Because when you are no longer driven by comparison, your actions carry more weight. They are not diluted by ego noise. They land cleanly. And clean actions have consequences. This is why non-competitive functioning often feels heavier. You cannot hide behind ambition or rivalry. You cannot say, everyone else is doing it. You are responding directly to reality. This directness can feel exposed, but it is also honest. The final misunderstanding to dissolve is this. People believe competition is what keeps them alive, that without it, they will stagnate, disappear, fade. But competition was never the source of vitality. It was a stimulant. Vitality comes from engagement with reality. And engagement does not require rivals. It requires presence. Presence is not exciting. It is steady. This steadiness is often undervalued. But it is what allows continuity. When competition ends, life does not narrow. It widens. Because you are no longer filtering experience through comparison. You are not asking, how does this position me? You are asking, what is this? That question opens perception, instead of closing it around status. This is why creativity often increases after competition collapses, not because you are trying to be original, but because you're no longer imitating or opposing. You respond directly. Originality is a byproduct, not a goal. The same is true for contribution. You contribute without measuring impact. You do what fits, and fitting actions accumulate meaning over time, quietly, without announcement. This is why Jung describes certain psychological problems as outgrown, not conquered. Competition does not end in triumph. It ends in irrelevance. It simply no longer applies. Trying to revive it feels awkward, like returning to an old argument you no longer believe in. You can still understand it. You just cannot inhabit it fully. This is the final stabilization. You are no longer tempted to prove your worth, because worth is no longer comparative. You are no longer tempted to win, because winning no longer organizes meaning. You are not above others. You are not below them. You are alongside reality, responding. This is why the absence of competition is not weakness. Weakness avoids demand. The state meets it, without spectacle, without rivalry, without needing to be seen. It is quieter than ambition, but more durable. And durability matters more than intensity, because life is long, and competition burns fast. The psyche that no longer competes is not declining. It is conserving energy for what actually matters, what actually requires response, what actually needs attention. This is not passivity. It is coherence without rivalry. And once this coherence stabilizes, regression becomes obvious. Status games feel artificial. Comparison feels crude. The psyche no longer fits inside them, not because it is superior, but because it has reorganized. This reorganization is irreversible if it is genuine. You may still notice competition around you, but it no longer pulls you in. It no longer defines you. It simply exists, like weather, and you move through it without needing to outrun it. This is where the R completes. Power without ego made competition unnecessary, and the end of competition makes coherence possible, not as an achievement, as a state, quiet, functional, sufficient, beyond comparison, and exactly where effort belongs once identity no longer needs to win.